Good morning, y'all. It's time for Coffee and Vintage Chat. This is episode 2, and I thought that for our second episode, we would talk about storing vintage clothing. I'm going to focus on talking about vintage that you wear often or vintage that you intend to wear sometime in the future rather than long-term storage in this video, just so we can talk about the do's and don'ts of how to take care of that daily wear vintage, which is what I primarily focus on when I'm shopping, buying, and selling for the shop. Okay, so first I want to apologize. I'm sitting in a chair that creaks. I hope it doesn't do that too much during it, but there is a few basic do's and don'ts to storing your vintage. And these may not be things that all vintage sellers or collectors agree with, but this is my do's and don'ts. So I just want to get that out of the way first, that if you disagree with me, constructive criticism is welcome. The number one rule in storing your vintage is no wire hangers. No wire hangers ever.
No wire hangers ever!
Joan Collins for you there. If you get the reference. If you don't, you just think I look insane in that little clip. But if you get the reference, you'll understand why I'm saying it. There's a really good reason why you don't want to put your vintage on wire hangers. One, wire is metal and it rusts. And it oxidizes and it will just rust from normal. It doesn't have to get wet. It will just start to rust over time. And that rust will leave marks on the vintage. It will destroy the shoulders of the vintage. It will eat through it, the oxidization will. So what you find sometimes when you find vintage that's been stored on wire hangers are these like dark brown, reddish marks and stains all along the top of the vintage from where it touched the hanger. The other thing it does is it misshapes the vintage. Wire hangers are so hard, because they're metal, that they will misshape the shoulders and the necklines of the vintage clothing that's hung on them. So for our biggest rule of all is no wire hangers ever. If you've ever seen wire hangers on one of my racks, it's because somebody gave it to me or I purchased it and it was on the hanger. And most of the time I just take it off the hanger right away and get rid of that hanger. We don't even use them in our house. We don't want them. However, sometimes they make it into the house in the hanger and I'll keep it on that until I'm ready to really address any issues that the vintage might have and store it and clean it to list or to keep for myself. The other rule, and this one's really important in my opinion, is that any vintage that you intend to wear or store for any amount of time, the very first thing you want to do is you want to clean it. You do not want to store it with whatever stains that have been on it for years or whatever smells that are already on there. So a gentle hand wash is always recommended. Some pieces can go in the washing machine, but check the material, do a quick search and see if it's something you can wash before you do so. But definitely do wash them before you store them at all. So what is the ideal way to store clothing that is vintage that you intend to wear occasionally or even often? In a perfect world, you would have a cedar-lined closet with plenty of space between each item so that they can breathe, and they will be stored on padded hangers and with mothballs on them. I know, it's a lot. Not everybody has all of that. For me personally, I don't have the space for each item to have a little bit of space in between it so that it can breathe properly. If you have that kind of space, that's fabulous. I'm jealous. I want your closet. If you don't have that kind of space, there's other things that you can do. First of all, padded hangers, I highly recommend. I buy a lot that have like the velvet padding on the hanger, and it just keeps it from rubbing the clothing or damaging the clothing in any way. Plastic hangers are okay, but plastic really isn't good for vintage. And one of the things we need to talk about is, can you just store it in plastic tubs? Because I know I said in my last video that once I wash, photograph, and list an item online to sell, I store it in plastic. And you do not want to store your vintage long-term in plastic tubs. You don't want to store them in plastic bags. You know those those vacuum seal bags. They might seem like a good idea, but those damage vintage over time. So you do not want to keep it in a vintage tub for any amount of time. Mine's stored in vintage tubs for sometimes a couple weeks, sometimes a few months, and that's it. If you are using a tub system like I am, I check my tubs periodically. I check each tub probably once a month and make sure that no debris has gotten in there. There's been no like animal activity, that the items are all still folded neatly so that they're being stored properly. If you are going to store your items in that kind of method, an important thing to note is that you want to fold and stack from lightest item on top to heaviest item on bottom, because when you're folding those items and they're being stored long term, those creases can sometimes also damage fabric. So one of the things you don't want to do is have a very lightweight rayon dress folded at the bottom with like a heavy coat on top of it, so that those creases actually start to shatter and tear. So that's something else you want to look for. So can everything be hung on a hanger? No. So knitwear you don't want to ever hang on hangers, because knit items are quite a bit heavier than regular cloth items, and they tend to pull over time. And the more that they drag and pull on the shoulders, the more misshapen the shoulders are going to get. So what I get a lot when I find vintage knitwear is that it was hung up for an extended period of time. And I'm finding pieces that haven't seen daylight, haven't been out of a closet in 60, 70 years. And those items will have these saggy shoulders on them. And that's really unfortunate. And you can try to wash it. You can try to store it properly afterwards and try to get that shape back. But sometimes once they're misshapen, it's really difficult to get them back in the shape you want them in. If you're going to store knitwear, you're going to fold it. You're going to fold the heavier pieces on the bottom, the lighter pieces on the top. And you're going to do, if possible, if you can, archival quality tissue paper in between each knit item. And this will keep color bleed from happening. This will keep the items from, like if one item starts to have an issue, it will kind of separate them so that it doesn't extend to the other items that you have. So that's vintage knitwear. You're going to fold it. You're not going to hang it. You're never going to put it on, what is it? Wire hangers. Never on wire hangers. That's right. Chests are a good idea. And I know that when you go to, what you actually find when you go to estate sales a lot of the times are that these items are stored in cedar chests, because cedar keeps moths and bugs out, and that they are folded and that they have tissue paper or paper in between the items. And that's how you find these items from the 1800s that are still in good shape, because somebody had the forethought 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago to store those in a cedar chest like that. So a cedar chest is always a good idea. But again, like if you have a fairly large collection like I have, whether, it's for selling or for personal use, that collection isn't going to all fit into a cedar chest. I do recommend hanging a lot of your clothing on the proper hangers, and with proper attention being paid to them over time. Hanging them up is a good way to store them. And that's what I choose to do at my home. So I have like 5 or 6 racks sitting around my house with vintage stored on it. And they're all on velvet or padded hangers. And they don't have a lot of space, and I know I said that giving them space is good so that they can breathe, but I just don't have the room for it. In a perfect world, I would eventually have enough space to give each vintage item a little bit of their own little area to be in. Okay, it's back in focus. Sorry about that. The other thing, you're going to see a lot of, if you just Google how to store vintage or do's and don'ts of storing vintage, mothballs. Mothballs have been the primary way to protect your wool items and your knits and your cottons from being chewed on by moths. And I personally loathe, from the bottom of my heart, loathe the smell of mothballs, which is funny because as a person who loves vintage and goes on a lot of buying trips, you would think it would be a smell that I would be really used to, that it wouldn't bother me at all, that I would maybe even like it. Like I love old books. I love going into a bookstore and you smell that old book smell. I even love a little bit like that that perfumey, the older woman perfume smell that you find on a lot of clothing. I actually really like that. And that was like their face powders were perfumed a lot of the times, and their deodorants that they used. So I really like that smell. But to me, mothballs smell like vinegar. And as a person with a vinegar allergy, just smelling it makes my stomach hurt a little. And I know that that's psychosomatic, but I just can't stand the smell. So a lot of times if I get something and it smells like mothballs, I wash it before I ever hang it up. Like sometimes before I even bring it in the house, I'll leave it in my car overnight and then go and get it and like wash it. So mothballs are the best way to make sure moths aren't getting to your vintage. For me, because I don't like mothballs, I use a lot of the hanging cedar. There's like clip-on cedar blocks that you can buy and use. We also actually have cedar lined closets at my house, which is amazing and it helps a lot. I also, the biggest thing is just to like keep an eye on it. A moth is only going to get in there and eat everything if you don't check on your vintage. So I guess that would be one of the rules too, is if you have vintage in storage and it's something you're not wearing very often, or it's, say it's your winter vintage and you haven't switched out yet, check it. Check it once a month, check it every 2 months. And I know that might feel like extra work that you don't want to do, but if you really want to keep your vintage collection nice, you want to make sure it's stored properly, you want to make sure bugs aren't in there, you'll want to check it every now and then. I've even had a mouse get into a bin of vintage once and made a bed in it and just like tore it up and destroyed a bunch of Angora sweaters, and that was depressing. And had I noticed earlier, had I been checking it regularly, and this was 20 years ago, but hey, 20 years ago and it's still bothering me, that says something about how anal retentive I am, or it says something about, learning lessons. I learned a lesson. I never leave vintage for 6 months without being looked at or checked at some point. I even have some vintage in storage in a facility outside of my home, and I go and I check those occasionally because, God forbid, a moth get in there or some kind of bug get in there and destroy hundreds of dollars worth of vintage or priceless pieces. To me, they're always irreplaceable. So let's do a quick review. I know I've rambled a little. Mothballs, if you can't do mothballs, cedar lined chests and cedar closets help. Don't hang your knitwear, fold it lightest to heaviest. If you can, fold it with archival tissue in between. Try to hang on padded or velvet hangers. And the number one rule is no wire hangers ever. So I hope that helped a little. If you're new to vintage, if you're new to collecting and you're like looking for tips on storing your vintage, I hope that gave you some good ideas. I think I have a styling video that I'm coming up with next. But then after that, I'm open to suggestions about what you would like to discuss during our coffee and vintage chat. And I gotta drink some more of my coffee before it gets cold over here. There actually is coffee in here. I know it's hard to see, but there is. Maybe I didn't make as many faces this time as I made last time. I found that when I go back through and watch it, a lot of the videos, I can't help laughing at how many faces I make in it. I think I just have like a very expressive face. I make a lot of expressions, and sometimes I don't even make sense. I'll just be like mean mugging while I'm talking about how I love something. So I scowl a lot randomly. Anyways, yeah. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you think that this is a good format, if this works, if you'd like to hear about more subjects. Bye, y'all. Talk to you later.